adaptation, resilience. While the city was pursuing separate initiatives and programming to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the work of NVCC, the first NVCC from 2008 to 2010, was really on adaptation, building resilience, and it had a focus on infrastructure as well. There were key sectors identified in the first report related to infrastructure themes, and that's where the science that was produced by NVCC really was driven from. The first New York City Panel on Climate Change report was released in May of 2010. Prior to that, the first set of climate projections of record were released for the city back in 2009. In February 2009 was the first time the city had a set of science projections made available, which were developed by scientists working as part of the NVCC. The climate projections were provided in a document known as the Climate Risk Information Workbook, and it was part of 3 workbooks that were featured in the first NVCC 2010 report. The report had, typical chapters covering topics related to climate change in New York City, and then 3 workbooks that served as appendices. These workbooks were designed as appendices so that agency folks in the city could easily access their information, almost like a tear sheet. You could pull out a page or print a page of one of these workbooks that had the table showing climate projections and have it on your desk right next to you. There's need to be accessible information with the text supplementing it available as needed, but you'd have these easy-to-go-to charts. The other 2 workbooks that were published were an adaptation assessment guidebook, which really helped stakeholders, users of these information at the city level to go through an 8-step process of starting to formulate ideas for climate adaptation. And the 3rd workbook was the CPL, the Climate Protection Levels, an early take at design standards, let's say, for incorporating climate risk information. So those 3 workbooks is part of the larger 2010 report that was released in May of 2010. And this was really the first time, and this is the culmination of the work of the NVCC in providing the city their first look at potential impacts from climate change. There was a large chapter on infrastructure impacts, as I mentioned. There was a look at some of the legal mechanisms that could be utilized to respond, how the insurance industry may play a role in the response. And then the report concluded with a chapter on climate change indicators and monitoring. How can we track the changes that are occurring, not only scientifically, but also the impacts that our extreme weather and climate events are having on our city system. Some of these themes you'll see remain throughout the 10 years of this process. We'll talk a lot about indicators and monitoring, for example, in the context of the 2019 report, which was recently issued. As far as the science is concerned, you had a set of comprehensive projections for both mean changes and extreme events. The 3 big climate variables looked at in the report were temperature, precipitation, and sea level rise. And in addition to those, you had extremes such as the number of hot days, the number of days with intense rainfall, and also days and levels of coastal flooding events. Wherever possible, quantitative information was provided, but for some climate extremes such as large storm events, hurricanes, nor'easters, qualitative projections were provided as needed. The report was grounded in the latest climate science information, and it also drew upon expert judgment and the literature where needed. And in this report, in many ways, serves as kind of the underlying document, the basis for the resiliency work that was starting to take place in New York City. It was very important for the panel to establish that any future planning, any future preparedness activities need to be based on the local science. That local science was developed by the NVCC, and what the NVCC strives to do in developing their local science information is ground it and also work with the city, work with the stakeholders back and forth through a cogeneration process that pushes the boundaries on science while also incorporating the needs of decision makers. After the release of the 2010 report, we very much remained engaged with the city via CC Run and other research project activities. And in late summer of 2012, the city passed Local Law 42 in August of 2012, which codified New York City panel on climate, stating that the panel needs to meet at a fixed interval and at the same time provide regularly updated climate science projections. The goal was to align that cycle of meeting and projections with the IPCC climate assessment reports at the international level, because when the IPCC reports come out, that's when the new climate models are available for use. In late October 29th, 2012, Hurricane Sandy made landfall along the Jersey coastline and greatly impacted the city of New York along with the broader metropolitan region. 44 deaths in the city of New York, $19 billion of damage in the city. And Sandy really was a tipping point in terms of the response to climate risk in New York City. In many ways, it kind of accelerated conversations that had already been taking place. And I think amongst the science community, we feel that losses actually may have been averted because of the awareness of work like the NVCC was doing that enabled the city to plan and respond in advance. Knowledge of locations that might flood due to storm surge flooding, moving subway trains out of the yard and placing them in ground, for example. Little things like that made in preparation for the storm and definitely prevented loss and damages. And I think the awareness in many ways was driven due to the research efforts that had already been taking place. That actually related to CC Run's research. We actually held our project meeting for CC Run. Our annual project meeting was held just about a week after Sandy. It was hosted at Drexel, actually, and the entire research agenda of that meeting was focused on how, as a project, we could respond and address the needs that Sandy had already exposed. In many ways, the RISA and CC Run was science in place at that right time. In the days immediately following the storm, you had the opportunity to reach out to scientists who were aware of these storms and also start thinking about how these storms will change in the future. So the conversation, again, began to accelerate once the storm hit, and in January 2013, the New York City panel on climate change was reconvened, and at that time, the mandate was to update the climate science projections of record. At that time, the IPCC fifth assessment report, the models had then been available. And what the city wanted to incorporate in their initiatives post-Sandy was to have the best available local information as part of the rebuilding and recovery process. So the NVCC kicked off again in 2013 in really in rapid fashion to align with some of the city's priorities, developed a brand new set of climate science projections during the early months of 2013. Those early climate projections were released in June of 2013, and in June 2013, that was a simultaneous release with the Mayor's Office in New York City of their Special Initiative for Recovery, for Rebuilding and Resiliency, SIRR report. It was a 435-page report in our NVCC CRI document. The picture there on the screen of the 2013 report was about 70 pages, and that 70 pages of science is really the backbone for that larger 430-page document. Over 250 initiatives that the city was starting to pursue post-Sandy in the rebuilding and recovery process, making sure that in our rebuild we'd be more resilient to potential future storms. Following the 2013 updated climate science risk information in the CRI document, we did a larger assessment of full NVCC report that was then published in 2015, in February of 2015. That's the NVCC 2 report, the NVCC 2015 report. Again, all of these reports are available for free download online, so you can access the information. And in the 2015 report, not only did you have an updated set of climate science projections for the same variables that we previously worked on, you had a discussion of some new topics, such as the health impacts of climate risk, in particular looking at the health impacts of not only heat-health relationships, but in the wake of Sandy, there was a great focus on coastal flooding and extreme precipitation, how that can create public health risks, such as mold that develops if there's standing water left in homes and residences for a large period of time after the storm. There was updated coastal flood mapping that the NVCC prepared in addition to the static flood maps that they previously developed. There was some dynamic modeling that was approached. And that report, again, was released in February 2015, updated in advance. Again, co-generated information, a back and forth process with the city to design a report that really addressed the needs and to have the science information needed in recovery and renewal process. After the NVCC 2015 report, there was a bit of a lull in activity, but plans were immediately made to start the next in the process, which was the NVCC 2019 report, which, as I previously mentioned, was released just a couple weeks ago at an event on Friday, March 15th. The 2019 report is not actually an update of the climate science information. It's an incremental report when it comes to developing projections of record, and as we'll see in just a bit here, there were no new climate science projections of record provided in the 2019 report. The science advances were focused on new methods, new climate variables, that really laid groundwork for when the next set of projections is developed. The NVCC reapproached the idea of climate science, climate change indicators and monitoring, which we'll talk about. And in addition to that, there was an updated set of coastal flood mapping products produced for the report. And in addition to that, a new sea level rise scenario that tries to take into account some of the most recent observations globally and how that may impact sea level rise at the local scale. The 2019 report, again, freely available to download online, and it really marks kind of the next iteration of this ongoing work, and it actually is 10 years from the start of when NVCC first began. So you have the situation where you have some members actually have served throughout the process. I've actually been involved since the process got started. So with the release of this report, there was a celebratory event at the New York Academy of Sciences, which has published all three of the NVCC reports and really honored the work that the NVCC has been doing and how has it been informing policy in the New York City area. What's interesting to note is that over time, we've actually gone through we're now in the second mayoral administration of the process. And there has been, while the need for the information, the enthusiasm, and the desire to have the best available local science information has been maintained, the changing priorities of the different administrations has influenced the work as well. You know, with the new administration in New York City, there is greater focus on social and equity issues, and that's been incorporated in the 2019 report. A greater feature of working together with neighborhoods throughout the city. That's another theme that the new administration focuses on and has been incorporated in the report here as well. And a number of other topics. You know, the 2019 report goes back and focuses, again, with a large section on larger emphasis on infrastructure. So it really is comprehensive and marks a progression in the 10 years of this really excellent research that has been ongoing. We take a look at the outline of the report and what's featured in it. In addition to the executive summary, there's an introduction to the report which places it into context. The first section of the report is focused on urban climate science. The first chapter, New Methods for Assessing Extreme Temperatures, Heavy Downpours, and Drought, looks at the same core set of climate risks, focusing a bit more on extreme events and identifying potential new methods that can be utilized in the next set of NVCC projections, let's say as part of NVCC 4. In the sea level rise chapter, New York City, it's important to always keep in mind we're a coastal city. Although it doesn't seem like we are when you're standing in the middle of Midtown, we are a coastal city with over 520 square miles of coastline. Sea level rise, coastal flooding is a significant risk for our city. In this report, the new sea level rise scenario was put forward to address the possibility of a high-end, low-probability scenario of rapid ice loss in Antarctica. In addition, there's new coastal flood mapping and mapping products. In the NVCC report, there was a new survey of LIDAR data of the city, remapping the city's coastline. We were able to have access to that data, update the flooding and flood maps that we've prepared previously. What you'll see in a bit is that there's been a nice progression in terms of some key NVCC products that have been updated and iterated at each time. We did the same type of coastal flood mappings in each of these three assessments, so you can go to the reports and compare how that map has evolved with time. Of course, the information overlaid in many cases is updated, but you can see a consistent set of products that the NVCC has always been able to provide. In the second part of the report, Community Resilience and Critical Infrastructure, there's a chapter on community-based assessments of adaptation and equity. This really draws in line with what the administration's priorities are. It identifies 3 neighborhoods across the city, one in the Bronx, one in Manhattan, and one in Brooklyn, and looks at an individual neighborhood-by-neighborhood approach to how these areas are responding and building resilience to future climate risks. There's also assessments across the Northeast and how they've considered issues of equity and social justice in their adaptation planning. The next chapter in that report, the next chapter in section 2 is resilience strategies for critical infrastructures and their interdependencies. Returning back to some of the original focus of the NVCC 2010 work, there's a selected group of city sectors and systems, waste and water, for example, electricity, transportation, how each of these systems may be vulnerable to future climate risks. And then there's also a discussion of the interdependencies between this, such as when the power goes down, you also lose your power for the transit system. So the interdependencies is a new focus and feature of this work that something the NVCC hadn't extensively addressed previously. The final section of the report, section 3, is charting adaptation pathways. Again, focus on indicators and monitoring. There's a proposed schematic and proposed plan project for what a New York City climate change resilience indicators and monitoring system may look like. And the final chapter in the report, perspectives on a city in a changing climate, really looks at how the work has evolved over the course of the past 10 years. It's really a nice summary that goes through not only the past 10 years, but some of the earliest work in terms of climate risk and climate adaptation in New York City dating back to the early 2000s, 2001, the Metro East Coast assessment, and see how with time things have changed here. And then in the final piece of the report, there is a section on conclusions and recommendations for not only policy, but there's some recommendations for what the city can do as well. I'm going to now go through the key chapters of the report and just kind of summarize briefly what the key findings were for each of those different chapters. The executive summary of the report, if you're looking for more information, I would suggest highly looking at the executive summary, which really documents nicely key findings for each of the different chapters. It's a good starting point. to where in the report you may want to go for a deeper dive information. The first finding related to climate science is climate change is increasingly present in everyday New York. This is true not only from the physical science side of things, where we're seeing that there are higher temperatures during the summertime, our heavy downpour events are increasing, we're seeing the physical changing, but there's also growing awareness and perception of the residents of the city as well. People take notice when there are weather advisories issued now more so than they used to. They're aware of the changes that are occurring in their backyard. So there's a growing awareness in that. Climate risk in many ways is part of our everyday life. You know, if you live in a neighborhood where you know where the roadway floods during a heavy downpour event, you know if it's a rain event in the morning, you're going to commute to work differently, for example. Same thing if you know your subway line floods. That's just a greater knowledge, a greater awareness that we all have here in the city as the climate has been changing over time. The increases in temperature and precipitation that we're experiencing here in New York City are broadly tracking the 2015 projections. The 2019 report does not have new projections of record. Those projections of record remain those released in 2015. What we've done in this report is take a look at how the observed trends have been lining up or tracking the projections. Projections for climate science are usually done over longer time periods. In particular, with the NVCC work we've done is a 30-year period. A 30-year period is a long enough time period to kind of average out the year-to-year variability and see the true climate change signal. So in the 2020s period, which runs from 2010 to 2039, we're actually 10 years into that period now. And we are actually able to draw some inferences as to what may be happening. How are we tracking based on our observation? It's important to note that any comparisons such as this have to be viewed with caution because there is that role that natural climate variation does play over the shorter term, not only temporally, but over the spatial scale of the city as well. One addition to the report here has been the broadening of the number of weather stations that have been used in the analysis. Previously, the NVCC focused their science work on the Central Park weather station. In this report, you have not only Central Park, but LaGuardia and Kennedy airports, and some work based at Newark Airport in New Jersey as well. There was a common set of 6 climate extremes that were analyzed throughout the NVCC 2019 report. Those extremes are extreme heat and humidity, heavy downpours, droughts, extreme winds, cold snaps, and in addition to those, coastal flooding and sea level rise. Those are a set of 6 that were consistently kept across the different chapters. Each of the different chapters addresses a different number of these climate extremes. One of the advances in this report has been updated use or identification of use of potential methods that will advance the science. Based on the climate analyses, regional and global trends, and a review of the literature, what NVCC 3 has done is they've confirmed that the 2015 projections of record for use and resiliency planning for the city and the broader New York metropolitan region remain the same. The science of record does not change with this new report. What you can see on this figure here is kind of the evolution of the science product over time. This is the same chart that was created for all 3 NVCC assessment reports, different iterations of it. The difference between 2015 and 2010 being updated climate models, for example, and also the use of new greenhouse gas emission scenarios. For example, the difference between 2015 and 2019 is that there had been a smoothing procedure previously applied that's no longer being applied here. In addition, you're now 10 years into that climate projection period, which allows us to start to track where the projections are heading. It's important to note the sea level rise projections because of the methodologies that we developed and used. There isn't a continuous future time series like that, like the one for temperature and precipitation. and also the window is smaller for sea level rise can usually work over just a 10-year period as compared to the 30-year period used for temperature precipitation. So just to sum up, these are not new projections in the report. They're not new projections of record. There is new science there. However, the 2015's projections are the ones that are still being utilized as the projections of record and incorporated into resiliency and planning activities. Jumping ahead to sea level rise and coastal flooding, if you look at the trend at the battery tide gauge in lower Manhattan, which is the data point we use to assess how sea levels have been changing in the New York City area over the past 150 years, it's been rising at a rate of 0.11 inches per year, so it's risen about a foot over the past century, a little bit more than that when you extend it out to the full time period here. This rate is faster, nearly twice as fast as the global average rate of sea level rise. That is in part due to some local factors that influence the water levels here in New York City. The Gulf Stream, for example, movement of water, and processes dating back to even the last ice age. So we are rising, our waters are rising here faster than they are globally here in the New York City area. What the report really focuses on is the recent evidence that has shown that Antarctica is increasingly contributing to global sea level rise changes. If you've picked up a newspaper and seen the latest headlines for climate science, they're all pointing to how the land-based ice is changing, in particular in Antarctica. So the NVCC did, and this is an example of co-generated science where there was a large series of back and forth between the city and the NVCC. What they did to raise awareness of the emerging high-end risk, again, it's a higher risk with a low probability. The NVCC 3 developed a new sea level rise scenario known as ARAM, the Antarctic Rapid Ice Melt Scenario. With that, by the 2080s, there's upwards of 6.75 feet of sea level rise and 9.5 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. Just relative to the projections from 2015, the 90th percentile value of those projections for the 2018s was about 5 feet for the 2080s and 7 feet for the 2100s. So this is a scenario that goes beyond that. And in addition to the new sea level rise scenarios being presented, there's a new approach taken for the mapping of monthly tidal flooding through a metric known as mean monthly high water, and it provides a broader perspective on future flood risk. This is another new area that was covered here in the 2018 report. In addition to these new sea level rise scenarios, there were updated flood maps that were created that illustrate the risk of flooding. There was one created for mean sea level rise, one created for the 100-year flood event, and then another one for monthly tidal flooding. And if we experience sea level rise, the higher end of the NVCC 2 projections, by the end of the middle to the end of the century, monthly tidal flooding will begin to affect neighborhoods around Jamaica Bay by the 2050, and then a larger area towards the 2080s. Jamaica Bay is the body of water that sits right near Kennedy Airport, for those not familiar with the immediate geography. Here, what we're seeing, and this would be an acceleration of trends that are being observed today, is that there's more nuisance flooding. Ordinary storm events are causing flooding, whereas just a couple years ago, 10, 15 years ago, they were not causing any flooding. And that's just a result of sea levels rising rapidly. And this is projected to continue into the future and also accelerate, especially if we track towards the higher sea level rise scenarios. So what the flood maps can do is help users, decision makers, see areas that are potentially vulnerable and they are identified for a response. As was previously mentioned, there is a new focus in this report on community-based adaptation. Effective adaptation planning requires the incorporation of different forms of equity. What we know is that social vulnerability to climate change is unequally distributed across the city. As I mentioned previously, that there's these collaborative case studies with 3 neighborhoods, northern Manhattan, Hunts Point in the South Bronx and Sunset Park in Brooklyn, which demonstrate that high levels of social vulnerability to climate change overlap with disproportionate exposure to environmental and health stressors and gentrification pressures. This research really identified some of the most vulnerable spots within the city, which is extremely helpful from a planning context in which we can target these neighborhoods for a more complete response. New York City communities that are involved in many different forms of adaptation planning, but there's a desire for deeper engagement with the city via use of either fully collaborative or co-production planning approaches. There's a need, not only a need, but also a desire at the local neighborhood community scale for greater involvement in planning and building resilience to future climate change. And I'd like to draw attention to a video that we just posted on our YouTube actually the other day that was produced in conjunction with NOVA's Climate Program Office that highlights some of the work that CC Run has done with the development of social vulnerability index for New York, one of which is shown here. The vulnerability to climate change in New York, in that video really illustrates the vulnerabilities at the neighborhood scales and also the neighborhood response. It looks at heat and health risk, and it documents the work that a community group that was featured in this chapter here, The Point, how they're responding to climate risk. Vulnerability to climate change in New York City varies across different social groups, economic levels, and neighborhoods. Those vulnerabilities have been known over the course of the work, and with the spatial analysis of this vulnerability, we can target our resources to the areas of greatest risk. During heat waves, we can identify areas that have low uses of air conditioning rates, which can be tied to some economic factors, and in those neighborhoods, since the vulnerability is most greatest, we can open more cooling centers. That's kind of the transfer or handoff of science information to the decision makers between NVCC scientists and researchers and the city government and the policymakers. The final piece of the report was focused on climate change indicators and monitoring the system. This is just a prototype schematic of what that system may in fact look like. You have a series of different climate indicators that can be tracked. You can track the physical changes in the climate system, sea levels rising, number of hot days or downpour events. The impacts, power outages, subway disruptions. There's measures we can track vulnerability, and we can also track the strategies that have been put into place to build resilience. In order to put this system into place, though, we need to be interactions with the data collection agencies, those that are tracking this information, have it available. There'd be a processing center where the information could be put together. The city, the urban decision makers would be very much involved and engaged in this process, and there are also different policies, projects, and programs developed as part of the system as well. Again, local community engagement is an important feature of this work. Citizen science where possible, that's another area ripe for development, where we can take what residents are seeing or observing and bring it into policy planning. The NVCC 3, they've proposed that the city should establish this pilot NICLIM, New York City Indicators and Monitoring System. We want to include community scientists, stakeholder partnerships. It would include ongoing research and knowledge. It would focus, and what the report does is focus on an initial set of indicators for energy and transport, the transportation sectors. That's a large focus of the chapter, but it could be expanded to other sectors across the city as well. And it also looks at how indicators may track across the interdependencies among the different infrastructure systems. Another key theme that was presented in the 2019 report. Looking at the conclusions and recommendations, these are the conclusions and recommendations that the NVCC presented to the city. They stated that the city should establish a pilot system for the New York City Climate Change Indicators and Monitoring Network. As specified with Local Law 42 from 2012, the NVCC should be tasked with developing next generation climate change projections for use by the city. The methods were started to be outlined in this report. They will be carried out in the next NVCC assessment. You know, we looked at new climate variables here, for example, humidity, heavy downpours were examined in greater depth, as was drought. Could we use regional climate models, for example? How does the next set of projections start to take shape? The NVCC should coordinate with other regional organizations, such as CC-RUN, to conduct integrated climate assessments. CC-RUN played a tremendous role in the NVCC process, as our researchers really do the technical and background research of all the NVCC report activities. The members are there, but it's the researchers in part funded by CC-RUN that actually make it happen. Wherever possible, the city can allow for coordination between CC-RUN and the NVCC. And as part of this more ongoing, you know, creating a more integrated, smooth process, the city should host a climate summit once every mayoral term. So, like I said, there was a climate summit in celebration on March 15th up at the 40th floor of the 7 World Trade Center. Great views of the city and surrounding areas. The name of them was Science for Decision Making in the World. Pictured here is the different NVCC members, along with the audience at the event. It featured not only panel discussions, but also a series of keynote speakers, including from New York City's Office of Resiliency. And it focused not only on the findings of the report, but the broader context of cities and climate resiliency. So you had representatives from C40, 100 Resilient City in the room. And it was really a great day. It's about a half day, 3/4 day long event, where the science and the new findings of the 2019 report were presented, and it also culminated and celebrated in many ways the work of many of these researchers over the past 10 years. To wrap things up, two key organizations that participated in the event in the NVCC process, not only CC-RUN, a recent project that's puts together the seminar series, but also the Urban Climate Change Research Network, a network of hundreds of researchers from around the globe, all looking at the effects of climate change in the cities. And I know that the North American hub of the UCCRN was based down at Drexel, so both of these groups provided a significant effort and amount of time to make the NVCC event happen. So with that, I think I will wrap up my presentation. I'm not exactly sure if we'll take some questions or if any questions have been made available yet, but I'll certainly be around at the end of the seminar today to answer anything. And hopefully this sets a tone for our next speaker in terms of how the work in New York City is being done and compares it with work that is down the road. So thanks everyone for having me today.
Thanks, Dan. So if there's any questions for Dan quickly, we can ask a couple of questions and then move on to the next presentation. Anybody in the room or online? See when there was no questions online? Okay. Any questions in the room? Yeah.
This is really interesting. You spoke of using data to analyze what would happen at the city scale within New York. And so I was just wondering, are you producing downscale results within the group, or are you just using something from a global model?
We're using downscale projections. We're using downscale projection of downscaling approach in the 2015 report, the Delta method, which takes the grid boxes into the DCF, grid boxes into the DCF, that information, and that information for the observed climate record. So all of our climate records downscale, all of our information downscale through the NVCC process.
Any other questions? Okay, so with that, we'll, thanks, Dan. We'll move on. If you can unshare your screen, we'll move. Let's see. Okay, so our next presenter is Mr. Saleem Chapman from the Office of Sustainability. Let me, there you go, you're up.
right. Good evening, everyone. The last presentation set me up extremely well for what we're going to talk about quickly. So it talked a little bit about this idea of collaborative co-production around climate adaptation strategies. And so what I'm going to talk about here is a pilot program of that we ran in a socially vulnerable neighborhood in Philadelphia, and some of the results that we saw. Before we get started, I just wanted to give a brief overview of GreenWorks itself. So GreenWorks is now in its second iteration. It was updated from in 2016 from the original publication in 2009. And this version of GreenWorks set forth 8 visions. The idea of access to healthy, affordable drinking water and food, that all Philadelphians will be able to breathe healthy indoor air, as well as outdoor air, that this idea of efficient and affordable use of clean energy, that all communities were climate prepared, access to natural resources, access to safe and affordable transportation, cleaner neighborhoods, as well as an engaged constituency. And so the model for this was a little bit of a pivot for the office, that we shift away from trying to set a time-bound parameter as to when we would achieve certain things, but to set forth a vision for the Philadelphia we would like to see, and then begin to implement recommendations as to how we would get there, understanding that it likely won't happen in one mayoral administration. So when we began this process of updating GreenWorks and developing a new vision for sustainable Philadelphia, we heard through community meetings, online surveys, social media, as well as face-to-face interaction, that all neighborhoods weren't experiencing the progress of sustainability equally. And specifically, as we began to dive into local climate adaptation, we realized that all neighborhoods was not experiencing heat equally, that some neighborhoods were more disproportionately vulnerable to heat than others. And so what we did was to map heat vulnerability across the city, and what we found is that some neighborhoods could be as much as 22 degrees hotter than others. And with that data, we layered upon social vulnerability data on top of it that was attained from our health department. And it should come as no surprise to most folks in this room that those who mostly are people of color or lower income folks are in the neighborhoods that are most heat vulnerable. And so the differences in this in the outcomes that we see is likely attributed to the built environment. So the urban heat island, the fact that these neighborhoods often have less trees, less green space, more hard surfaces, which is a contributing factor for why we see some of the higher heat vulnerabilities than we do in other neighborhoods. But what we began to see, given those social economic outcomes, is that this idea of unequal exposure to heat was as much of a climate change issue as it was a social equity issue. And so it caused us to rethink how we approached our work and rethink how we would go about the planning process to remediate it. We took that into account with the understanding that these vulnerabilities will only get worse as climate change sets even more into the future. In Philadelphia alone, we are projected to experience 52 days, over 95 degrees by the end of the century. So significantly going to exacerbate the vulnerabilities that we saw in the last slide. So I just wanted to dive in a little bit about this nexus between climate change and inequality. And so the idea that there are many factors that influence community sensitivity to climate impacts and their ability to adapt. And it's important for us to acknowledge that lower income populations and communities of color are often overburdened with multiple and overlapping factors that cumulatively impact their ability to respond to these hazards. And so this disproportionate risk is likely the result of social inequities that stem from institutional and structural racism. So when we look at the idea of less green space or more hard surfaces, we can directly link that to past policies such as raillining. So as an institution, it was incumbent upon us to acknowledge these inequities and to begin to have a concerted effort to address the institutional and structural racism that often undermines these communities' ability to adapt to climate change. And so one strategy by which we have seek to go about this is to pursue inclusive climate planning that values and uplifts the voices and experiences of marginalized communities, and that seeks to address the root cause that enables these communities, that often precludes these communities from adapting and building more climate resilient communities. So we came up with this idea of developing equity as approach, and for our office it meant three things. Acknowledging that heat inequality exists in majority low-income Black and Latinx neighborhoods in Philadelphia, recognizing that our systems, policies, and procedures created these barriers and maintain these inequities, and to work to redress our resources towards dismantling these barriers. So that was what we were trying to accomplish. We needed to come up with a how. So with that, we selected a particular neighborhood in Philadelphia, Huntington Park. This neighborhood is both a park and a neighborhood, and its boundaries will sort of shift depending on who you ask there. But what we saw is that this is a majority people of color neighborhood. It's a majority, or at least a high proportion, bilingual neighborhood. And the areas of it are bounded by, for this project, Roosevelt Boulevard in Philadelphia, which is a major arterial for the city of Philadelphia. East of Broad Street, which is also another major arterial for the city of Philadelphia. But the notable landmark about this particular community, despite the fact that it experienced significant heat vulnerability, is an 87-acre park that the community derives its name from, which is Huntington Park. So why is Huntington Park so hot? The differences is in its built environment, as I said earlier. Huntington Park experiences an overwhelmingly disproportionate amount, under disproportionate amount of tree canopy and grass and shrubbery, as well as an overproportion of hardscapes and buildings. So 85% of the North District, which includes Huntington Park, is comprised of buildings and hardscapes compared to 51% of the rest of Philadelphia. Additionally, the North District, again, which includes Huntington Park, only contains 5.5% of the tree canopy in the city compared to an average of 18.6% of the city at large. And when you're considering grass and shrubbery, which you see on the screen, the North District only has 8.9% compared to an average of 23% in the rest of the city. So when we began this process, an 8-month community engagement process that resulted in an engagement of over 600 residents and 30 partners, we did so with 3 goals in mind. To understand how Huntington Park residents were experiencing heat in the summer and what resources they could use to help stay cool in their homes and neighborhoods. To inform residents about the urban heat island effect, its impact on community health, and how to stay healthy and safe in the heat. And to work together, again, this co-creation process to create a Huntington Park heat plan with neighborhood-specific recommendations and implementation partners. So to begin this process, what we did was assemble a community heat team that was composed of 30 organizational partners and 5 resident ambassadors whom we compensated for their time, which is an important part when you're engaging marginalized communities, that you're ensuring that folks are able to contribute equitably, and that you remove all barriers that might preclude their participation. We did so sort of implementing a train-the-trainer model, where we trained these 5 ambassadors to go out on the behalf of the heat team and to engage with residents around the urban heat island effect and how they were coping with heat in their neighborhood. We did over 20 events using a Beat the Heat mobile station that included heat-related resources and information, a heat survey, to which I will talk a little bit about in a moment, hand fan making, as well as giveaways. And we brought this, again, to 20 locations all throughout the community, both indoors and outdoors, both your traditional planning settings, such as community centers, but also places such as barbershops and places where people naturally congregate. So we collaborated with the community heat team as well as the University of Pennsylvania to develop a neighborhood heat survey. To beat the heat, ambassadors administered the survey with during block captain cleanups, clean water, cold water distributions, community events. We also mailed this survey to local block captains for distribution, and we held public workshops as well. All this resulted in us getting 530 respondents in the course of about 2 months. We had fairly good distribution in the respondents, so 74% of those who responded to the survey did so in English, as well as 26% who were surveyed did so in Spanish. The median age for respondents was 45, so we were able to get a broad swatch of people. And most of the folks who responded were actually residents within Huntington Park itself, with 71% in the one zip code that makes up the area and 5% in other. So we followed up the information and data that we obtained from the surveys to do a heat design workshop, to which we engaged 40 participants to design specific cooling interventions that they would like to see in their neighborhood. Things that we've identified were cool roofs, more tree plantings, cooling spaces, and bus shelters in their neighborhoods to allow for more equitable transportation. We went to the school and had a community fair, to which we gave away trees. Over 70 trees were given away that particular day, and we had over 100 participants come out. We paired this with an environmental jobs resource fair to try to connect people with opportunities within the sustainability movement, in addition to providing the education that we did. One of the key recommendations that came out of this process was that cooling centers typically don't work. There are a lot of reasons why it doesn't, but when you're dealing with marginalized communities, the first thing you have to address is that there's often a distrust with public entities for a lot of reasons. And so we came up with this idea of building a heat relief network that was based upon community partners who were embedded in the community. So we organized 2 meetings with faith leaders and community organizations within the neighborhood to map existing cooling assets and resources and to incorporate them into a neighborhood heat relief network that will be deployed during emergency heat events and heat waves. So this is just a quick summary of some of the feedback that we got from our survey. To run through this fairly quickly, and I apologize for all the text on the slide. Heat was a very important issue for the community. I think that was the biggest takeaway. I think sometimes there's a misnomer that we're dealing with disadvantaged neighborhoods, that climate change and sustainability issues rank lower on sort of the hierarchy of need, but what we found is that folks actually cared about this a great deal. We also found out that even though many survey respondents had access to some type of air conditioning in their home, residents still felt hot inside their home, and that the access to better air, AC and fans was a need that they identified during high heat days. A lot of this was due to the fact that residents use inefficient window units, and the resulting cost that is associated with the use of those inefficient units was a cost barrier that prevented them from utilizing the air conditioning all throughout the day. Sometimes it was strategic times to cut it on for a period of time and then cut it off, and obviously we know that that isn't necessarily the most efficient use of the air conditioning system. We also found that awareness of utility assistance programs were pretty low, and that the burden was on us to increase access to information. Only 40% of the survey respondents had heard about energy programs and utility bill programs to reduce their costs. Relatedly, only 4% of the respondents who answered did not use AC because of their inability to access these utility assistance programs. So really what the outcome that we took from this is how do we best structure these programs to make them more accessible for residents, and one of the most easiest ways for us to do that was to make sure that it was accessible by language, because what we saw is that there was a disproportionate percentage amount among the people who were English speaking primarily and who knew about these programs as opposed to those who were primarily Spanish speaking. So over 60% of the respondents expressed a desire for more street trees. Again, with the language access issue, one of the things that we noticed about Huntington Park is that for a long time, tree plantings were not happening there at a really good rate, and the primary reason for this is that the Tree Tenders program, which is a primary program that the city uses to do outreach and stewardship around tree plantings, had never had a translated tree tenders training. And so once we did that, actually, the tree plantings in Huntington Park accelerated at a pretty significant rate. Many of the residents did express a desire for continued tree maintenance as well as education. So what we have sort of found out is that, again, there's often a misnomer that residents in these communities are averse to trees, but really what we've identified is that it's often that they've had a poor experience with a particular tree, whether it was the wrong type of tree that was planted, the wrong species, or whether it was not maintained appropriately, to which it led to some sort of damage to their property, but not that they were inherently against trees in itself. As a matter of fact, they were actually very eager to have these trees in their neighborhood. So as I said before, some of the recommendations that we took away is how to increase better access to home energy assistance programs. One of the immediate next steps that we took from this, the LIHEAP program, which provides energy assistance for low-income residents. In Pennsylvania, is only allowable to be used during the winter months. And so part of the next step is to think about how that program can be expanded to also apply to folks' energy bills during the summer months as we begin to experience more significant, less colder winters and more warmer summers. There was also a desire for more block-level cool roofing coatings, as well as other cool strategies such as cool pavement demonstration projects at large-scale facilities. So it was this idea of a heat relief network. I touched on this a little bit earlier, of using trusted actors within the community. So shifting away from the government as sort of the primary implementer and thinking about faith institutions as the primary implementer of a heat relief network, as well as how to program these spaces. So one of the things that we heard is folks would be more likely to go to these facilities if they have more of a social atmosphere. A cooling center is typically a place where you go, you hang out, you enjoy the cooling, but there isn't much else happening there. And so for a lot of folks, that was a significant barrier. So if we could find a very responsive programming to put in these places, it might increase the likelihood that they would be used. And so for our thinking, it was how can we merge the two strategies? How can we increase access to social services such as the energy assistance program within the cooling centers? And that's a way both to solve two issues at once. That it would be more attractive for folks to get out because they're getting some sort of tangible benefit to assist them with it, as well as allowing us to get folks out of coping with heat within their homes and into the cooling centers. We've also sort of reached out to local businesses and other local community-based institutions to think about hosting a movie screening there, as well as having local restaurants donate food to make these places more attractive. We also wanted to think about what are ways we can communicate this better. So perhaps the city's existing strategy for communicating heat relief when heat relief cooling centers are open, isn't necessarily most effective for these communities. So how can we think of a more local strategy that might resonate more so with this community? Transportation and actually just getting to the cooling centers was a barrier to folks. So one thing that they would like to see is more bus shelters along popular routes, as well as accessible routes for walking and biking and taking transit. They would also like to see rerouting truck traffic out of their neighborhood, which we know harms air quality during any day, but certainly during high heat days, as well as safer routes for traffic crossing. So in one particular example, to get to the nearest cooling resource in Huntington Park, you have to cross Roosevelt Boulevard, and for those who are less familiar with Roosevelt Boulevard, is actually one of the most dangerous interstates to cross as a pedestrian in the nation. And so the idea that these residents would have to do that to get to a particular place is I cannot stress enough how much of a disincentive that is for them. So in terms of next steps for our work, we will be releasing that Huntington Park heat plan and neighborhood heat toolkit so that this can be replicated in other neighborhoods this spring. And we are bringing on another heat resiliency fellow this summer to sort of continue piloting implementation of that heat relief network for the first time this year. And with that, I am concluded.
Any questions? I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about the network for the heat relief. I mean, is this people just opening their homes to their neighbors in some cases?
Yeah, it's interesting as you say that because that's actually one of the stories that we saw, and I'm gonna answer your question, but I'm gonna go a little tangent. There was actually one particular community member who had a tree in their backyard, and we noticed that this became a congregating spot for all members of the community because there was this one particular tree, and it was a ability to provide some sort of heat relief, and so folks would come from all over the neighborhood to gather around it. We will continue to encourage those strategies, but that isn't the basis for our network. What we are trying to do is to engage community-based institutions to sort of open their doors, and then to sort of think about how we can use an asset-based strategy to think about what are the strengths of the individual partners. So perhaps this particular institution has a projector, and this particular institution has a screen, and so how can we get those together to be utilized? So basically, our strategy for this summer, and following up as the meetings that we've already had, is just let's put all the resources on the board, and let's figure out how to most strategically and employ those in the context of a heat emergency. So we transitioned away from this idea of calling it a cooling center network, because understanding that every partner won't be able to provide a cooled space, but this idea that a heat relief network, that you can provide some sort of resource that will encourage people to come out of their homes in order to get into these cooling spaces when they are experiencing a heat emergency.
Who controls the rules on the LIHEAP program?
Oh, the LIHEAP. That is the Harrisburg State Legislature. So that would need to be changed in Harrisburg for that.
Some sort of state legislature get onto that.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear
The
that.
logical rule would be to get some state legislature from the area onto changing those rules.
Yes, yes.
Just geographical.
Mhm.
Is that I caught on when I moved to town long ago that the row house model in Philadelphia certainly saves a lot of heat in the summer, in the wintertime, and clearly it makes it so it's cold, not so comfortable in the summer. That's how we developed the marble stoops and so forth for people to hang out. I mean, it's a cultural thing. But that's not limited to Philadelphia. So you go to the coal country, Ashland, those towns, those are long row houses. So it is not a strange concept for legislators in Harrisburg to sit there and explain that logic and say, how about crowbar a little bit of money for air conditioners in the summer? I mean, it's not like you're talking to people in Montana.
I agree with you. In a previous life, I was an environmental lobbyist, and I'm engaged in that conversation. Yeah, I mean, I do think that there is a lot of logic to this, and what we are trying to think about from the city's perspective is how we can really think more, present the evidence out there and think more strategically about how we are connecting people to energy assistant resources. For instance, we've been engaging the Mayor's Office of Community Empowerment, who sort of is the primary deployer of low-income assistance programs in the city of Philadelphia, to think about strategically how we can sort of make the best case for changing some of the programs that need to be changed in order to provide the resources for these communities as we are shifting with climate change and how these programs need to be utilized.
Just on a personal note, you're 22 degrees. The difference in the city, on some days you can be
I wasn't involved in the mapping of it, so but I would be happy to follow. Yeah.
I grew up in a housing project in Boston, okay? And it wasn't a treated site. And that place, relative to here, halfway to the Arctic Circle, it was unbearably hot in the summer. I understand that the city, the reflection, the effect of trees and so forth, and all that. So the physical dimensions, it just never apparently occurred to people. That trees do what trees do, and there you go. I mean, some of this is, I don't mean to be demeaning at all, fairly obvious. If you could map the tree canopy across the city, and I'm pretty sure that it would map very closely to your disparity in temperature, and thus this is the solution. Although I understand that in North Philadelphia, a fair number of neighborhoods, I don't know where you put the trees. I mean, when you have the number of streets, and then you put streets in between. So there's difficulty. I'm trying to say is that I have a personal understanding of the difference between one neighborhood and the other neighborhood, same day, just by moving 100 feet, many degrees.
Yeah, I think that's. I would say I also have anecdotal stories to share on that note, and I should mention too that this is the outcomes that we've seen from this study has actually influenced how the city has gone about thinking about tree planting. So previously, sort of the goal is to plant as many trees as we can, given as a resiliency strategy to climate change, but we weren't thinking very strategically about where we were planting those trees. So looking at how we can better more equitably distribute those resources so that we're preparing the most vulnerable communities to adapt to climate change is how we're beginning to think about it. So the city actually next year will be undergoing an urban forestry strategic planning process that will center equity at the heart of it.
I think that touches on my question. This is a really fantastic study engaging local population. Are there things that you learned that made you think these are transferable ideas to other parts of the city that had those great exposures to heat, or would you want to go into another area, say in Westwood, and ask similar questions?
Yeah, I think if we had unlimited resources and unlimited staff capacity, I think we would do this level of deep engagement in every single neighborhood, because I think the only way to truly uncover the strategies that will be able to be taken by the community and implemented in the long run needs that level of deep engagement. I think from one of the things that we have saw when we started out this process, we hired a fellow that was only going to be there for 1 year, so we sort of knew that the level of support we were going to be able to provide was going to expire at some point. So we really thought strategically about how we can structure this project and formulate recommendations that the community could carry forward once the city left. And so I think to get that level of buy-in, you need to engage a whole bunch of different actors and to meet people where they are. And I applaud our fellow for the number of events and the number of places that they intended to get that level of engagement. So I think it works. That's sort of our perspective. I think we would like to have the resources to replicate this. I should mention that this was a grant-funded project, so we would have to secure additional funding to model this. I think from the city's perspective, what we're thinking about is, as we're looking towards citywide climate adaptation planning, is maybe deploying this level of engagement in the most socially vulnerable neighborhoods, but taking a sort of more broader look at some of the other neighborhoods in terms of our planning processes. I think some of the things that we sort of learned was sort of a lot of the things that we shared. I think sort of having the data to back up some of the misnomers that I think we knew were out there, but we didn't necessarily have the information to back it up was something that we were really struck by. And I think some of the small changes that we could take that would make a huge impact. So again, the language access piece, I mean, it doesn't take much for us to sort of get things translated and how much of an impact that would have.
So I thought it was really interesting, trying to build the faith-based organizations into the heat relief network, in part because I'm doing some work right now in the island nation of Grenada. And it was interesting, I just learned that Grenada actually uses its churches for disaster relief production for the same reasons, and they train folks in the churches to actually do this type of resilience planning, which I thought was really interesting because of the same kind of trust issue. So I thought that was kind kind of an interesting connection that you're finding here as well. But then I had another question. So you started off the presentation by saying that, sort of Greenworks has shifted to visions as opposed to, specific milestones. And so I'm kind of curious about that because on the one hand, I understand resource constraints and time constraints and, personnel constraints, but if anything, your research here and the research we heard in the previous presentation, which is probably not unlike what Philadelphia's experiencing, these situations are getting worse, right? It seems that it's the time for more concrete steps, right? In other words, to take this kind of research and then follow up immediately with specific infrastructure plans. And I appreciate the work that's going into, developing the cooling centers and stuff like that. But could you just speak a little bit to the city and, the challenges that it's facing in trying to fund resilience measures? After you do this deep dive into community, you find out like, hey, these are some great things we can do. How is the city moving in terms of then trying, like, having the resources to actually do those things?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the first point in terms of the strategic shift from Greenworks was how do we make the idea of sustainability more accessible to people? So I think, using terms such as CO2 metric tons, right? I think for a lot of folks was not accessible for a lot of Philadelphians. I think that was the one sort of idea. The other idea is that, we could have sort of laid out a plan in 2016 with the understanding that here are some things that we know we can do in the next 4 years to do it within one administration. I think our vision was, it's like, how can we engage folks and get an idea and broad buy-in around what we would like to see as a city, and then take that back to implement concrete steps. So it wasn't an either-or choice, but more of an and approach, which is like, let's set the vision where we want to go, and then let's sort of identify the specific strategies that would get us there, was sort of our approach. I think in terms of how we are approaching resiliency, I would say, it's a difficult environment, right? I think when you're dealing with a city such as us, when we still have a third of our population almost in poverty, I wouldn't say that there are other pressing needs in terms of the city's budgeting priorities, but I wouldn't say that what our sort of thinking is and how we're approaching this is how we can tie in and infuse sustainability within all these other areas, right? So it isn't necessarily this approach over here where we're just thinking about resiliency building, but that we're really looking at it holistically in terms of, okay, how is this a poverty alleviation measure? Well, if we're getting folks access to more efficient air conditioning units, or opening up the LIHEAP program so that it's able to be accessed during the summer months, then that's a resiliency initiative as well as sort of a poverty alleviation initiative, because it's not allowing people to experience the heat burden. So I would say sort of our overall strategy is understanding that probably isn't a significant windfall of new resources coming. And so how can we think strategically within the existing resources that we have to be creative in terms of implementing resiliency strategies? As I said before, so again, example of that was the tree canopy exercise, right? We were already deploying tree plantings as a resiliency measure. So the idea now is like, how can we more equitably and more strategically deploy those existing resources so that we are getting our greatest impact from them in disadvantaged communities. And the last piece I would say is that we are beginning to think about broader resiliency planning. So the city completed its municipal climate adaptation plan in 2015, which only focused on municipal assets, and that sort of laid out a plan that sort of next step in that process was beginning to look beyond just municipally owned assets and do the city at large. And this was sort of the first step in that process to think about, okay, how do we take a broad swath of the city, but understanding that certain communities was going to need more intensive engagement and trying to identify an engagement model that would allow us to do that.
So are some of these insights that your office is developing being codified? So in explicitly stated that, in the plan for introducing trees into the city, that there would be some spatial prioritization based on vulnerability, for example, or is that a more difficult sort of linkage to create formally?
We haven't gotten here, so I don't want to, and we don't have complete oversight over it, so I want to be careful here. But I think I would say yes. We would go so far as to identify it as a priority for what we're doing, and it's not looking at equity as this sort of abstract approach. But if I bring the map up in terms of heat vulnerability, we have sort of the data to back it up that these are probably the places where your trees need to go, even if we don't even take the social vulnerability data into context. But knowing that these vulnerable neighborhoods also overlap with the those who are socially vulnerable just sort of coincide. So I would go as far as to say yes, that will be codified, and I think we have a rationale to support it. No matter what.
Do we have any questions online for either Saleem or the previous speaker?
For that question, I look forward to
Oh, okay. All right. So if there's no other questions, let's thank our two speakers.